Hello, historians. Today we're going to be talking about some of the major causes of the Great Depression and what it was like in the 1930s. As always, this is a very general overview of the situation. There are a lot of wonderful videos out there, though, that I recommend if you really want to know how it was. Ken Burns' The Dust Bowl is a really remarkable documentary, and there's a lot of different videos on what it was like to live in the Depression, tons of videos on what people were eating and how they made do with this huge economic recession that people were facing at the time. So let's get started. Okay, so Roaring 20s. So after World War I, we came home, and so for the decade from 1920, 1930, 1931, 1932, things were chugging along. People were doing relatively decent. There was a lot of discretionary income. Businesses were doing well under the laissez-faire capitalist system. And so it was party time. Unfortunately, it was kind of a veneer because the Roaring Twenties was being bought on credit. And the thing is, when you're buying on credit, everything's okay. You're making your payments every month. One hiccup, and the interest snowballs, things just start getting worse. And we're going to see that this wonderful economy that we were chugging along with in the 20s was really just a house of cards on an unstable platform. So come 1929, screech. Okay, anyway, 1929, beginning of the Great Depression. I kind of misspoke when I said 1931, 1932, 1933. Those were horrible years. But there's a reason I had those numbers in my mind. I'll tell you a little bit. Okay, so there were many factors. So I'm going to give you just a few to begin with, and then I'm going to give you another list. So there was a weakness in the U.S. economy. We had too much of our nation's capital in steel, oil, railroads, in these big trusts, really. And as they owned so much of the means, like they owned all the competition, so there wasn't a good competition for these industries, but they also owned the shipping, the barrel making, and all the supply chain stuff. So when one started to falter, it was taking a lot of it with it. If we had a more diversified economy, we wouldn't have felt it necessarily as bad. Also, there was an uneven distribution of wealth. The richest people had way more wealth than the lower percents of the population. Not that this happens now, of course, but anyway, the people were living paycheck to paycheck. They weren't as stable as they thought, so when their paychecks started having problems, they weren't able to weather the tight economy. Once again, we were living on a credit-structured economy. People were buying on time. They were making payments to creditors. Anybody see Henry Winkler's American Christmas Carol? Him going around repossessing people's stoves and stuff? That'll give you an idea. It wasn't credit cards, it was banks. And anyway. But what I really want to tell you about, and where we really came into it, is this is a worldwide phenomenon. The Great Depression was not an American economic crisis. It was pretty much a world economic crisis. And going back in time, a major factor is the end of World War I and the ill-conceived Treaty of Versailles. Germany was shut out of the talks for the Treaty of Versailles. So America, Germany, France, and their allies were in a room making the decisions about how this treaty was going to be written and what was going to be said. So when they came out, they said, Germany, you have to accept full culpability for the Great War. They didn't call it World War One yet. We didn't know there would be a part two. So, Germany, you're on the hook for the Great War, and you owe us $55 billion. Germany panic. Okay, Germany had to accept the terms. They had no choice. So, um, what ended up happening is Germany didn't have $55 billion. Who does? So, they're making payments over time, and the German economy is getting pinched and pinched and pinched and tighter, and they're like, we can't keep making these payments, the reparation payments. So America steps in. No problem, Germany. We know you need to pay France and England for your war debt, and turns out France and England need to pay us for their war debt because they borrowed all kinds of supplies and ships and such off of us. And so our banks started lending money to Germany. Germany used that money to pay, it's not just England and France, it was other countries too, it was America. But these were the biggest names that were going on, and the most amount of money was owed to these countries. So Germany was paying England and France. England and France was using that debt payment to pay back what it owed to the United States. This was coming into our economy. We were lending more to Germany. So now Germany owes not only reparations to England and France and the Allies, but they now owe us repayments on the loan with interest too. And things are getting tighter and tighter and tighter. So the Weimar Republic was the German leadership with Weimar Republic at the time. They were starting to feel the pinch really bad, and the German mark, their currency tanked. So think about, like right now we're going through a recession here, right? Think about a year ago, you went to Publix or whatever shopping place of choice. How much would $100 a year ago purchase you in groceries? Versus right now, we're in fall of 2022 when I'm recording this. It's getting you significantly less groceries, right? Imagine that. I think I read today that it's like 8.5% inflation. Imagine Germany went through, and this is without me being sarcastic or anything, an 850% inflation rate. They were taking wheelbarrows of money to go buy bread and eggs and milk and stuff. They would negotiate the price of the meal because the currency was devaluing so much that by the time they finished that meal, it would have cost them twice as much. Like the employees were getting paid several times a day, and their wives were running over to the factories so they could collect the pay, so it would be worth something, or it would be worth more during lunchtime when they got paid as opposed to at the end of the night. That's how bad it was. So Germany was suffering. They had no money, which led to some leader saying, hey, I know why we're here and how to get us out of it. And unfortunately, the Germans clung to this person like a life raft, and it turned out to be a megalomaniac monster. But right now, we're in the 1920s, and the German citizens are suffering. Their currency is worth nothing. It ended up being worth more wallpapering their house with it than using it as currency. It was so bad. But anyway, Germany calls France. France, we gotta talk. We can't afford to pay you. Can you maybe skip a few payments, or can we maybe pay less or something? Can you work it out with us? France says, okay, Germany, I'm going to put you on hold. Give me a minute. I'll talk to you. France calls up, America, we got to talk. Germany can't pay me anymore. Can maybe we skip payments to you, or maybe because you were our allies in this war and you wanted us to win too, what if we cancel the debt that France and England owe to you. America gets on the phone. Absolutely not. We are not going to pay for Europe's decadent wars. You have to pay us back. So France gets on the phone. Germany, sorry. Turns out America won't let us off the hook and we have to pay them, so you gotta pay us. And, okay. So, Germany defaults. Or Germany's not able to pay. They're doing so bad. It's just like pulling all the money out of their country. France and England can't pay America, and because France and England can't pay America, America has no money to lend to Germany, and you see, like an engine seizing up. The Dawes plan fails. Sad. Okay, so this once again is hurting people around the world because we had trade deals all over everywhere, and without money, like, we're not ordering stuff. Raw materials are getting unharvested. It was rough. But now we're going back to the United States. And, okay, once again, this house of cards. We were living on credit. As the currency was having a little bit of problems, things started tightening up. Produce farmers had for years been like right on the edge of defaulting in their mortgages because produce wasn't returning. They were working kind of at cost. They'd been trying to seek agricultural parity for years. Hey, government, can you be the purchaser of last resort so we don't have to sell our produce at a loss? And because of laissez-faire capitalism and us not thinking it was our job to invest in that kind of thing, people should stand on their own 2 feet, we refused. We're flirting with the idea, but for the most part, we didn't do it. Calvin Coolidge, like, nope, nope, nope. So, then, and I'm going to get to this in a second, things got bad, and we put in this holy smoot tariff trying to protect American businesses. So, what we said is, okay, if we're going to use a pretend, because I'm going to say, what if it costs $70 to import like an I-beam of Canadian steel, and it costs $100 for that same I-beam of American steel? Like, if you're a contractor, you're going to say, wow, the $70 I-beam is the one I'm going to have to buy because it would be foolish to waste that much money if they're the same product. So the tariff is put in place to make, I mean, there are punitive tariffs to punish countries, but in this case, this was a protective tariff. So if we put a $30 tariff on all steel I-beams, remember, I'm playing loosey-goosey with these numbers and Canadian steel and all, so don't listen to me on that. But imagine now you're a contractor and the $70 Canadian I-beam has a $30 tariff, now $100. And the American I-beam is $100. That's when, hey, Buy American kicks in, and it makes them to an equal choice except for the patriotism thing now. It should mean that more people are buying the American steel. This isn't really, though, what happened in the Great Depression. Things were so bad. Now, you just priced people out of being able to buy the good altogether. So, even the people who would have been able to keep continuing with their work, steel might be suffering, but the companies, the builders and stuff might have still been able to go on with their work, but now you price them out of market. You price shoppers out of the market if the imported good now costs more than they could afford. And then I'll tell you about the Dust Bowl later. But what I want to tell you about now is the stock market, and that's this next. So, okay, the majority of Americans didn't have any money in the stock market. They didn't have any stake in the game. So the reason the Black Tuesday crash of October 29, 1929 hurt us so bad is because it hurt us psychologically. So, okay, I'm going to show you a graph. So if you look here, there was an artificial inflation going on in the stock market. It was in this last little bit of 1929, there had been you know, rich people doing rich people things, manipulating these stocks. So it was artificially high up to begin with. But then there was a hiccup, and Black Tuesday hit. It's like, okay, this is really scary. And people started thinking there's something wrong with the money. And once people start thinking something's wrong with the money, it becomes so. So here, there was a short recovery. Like within a month or so, things started chugging along again. But then, because of the something wrong with the money, people started getting nervous and doubting it. And so what was happening is, people feel like, hey, we're going to be going through some hard times. I mean, people now, the bankers and stuff, remembered the 1893 panic. They remembered how horrible that was. People went through a lot of rough times for that time period. So they remembered what a really bad recession felt like. So people were starting to tighten their belts. They were spending less. So imagine you're going through it now. And instead of, on your way to work every day, you stop for a venti soy latte half-calf thing. And it's $5 every time you're on your way to work. And then you start thinking, you know what, $25 a week is a lot of money. Maybe I could brew some coffee and add soy milk to it at home. Okay, so you're spending less, $25 less a week. And you and a couple hundred other people are doing the exact same thing. So the coffee shop now has less customers, which means less profit, of course, but they need fewer coffee servers. And so they either reduce hours or they have to lay people off. Because you and a couple hundred other people were worried about that $25, people get laid off. And then those coffee clerks can't go over to fast food restaurant next door, and fast food restaurant starts to suffer. And then those people that work at that fast food restaurant then can't pay for tutoring or to get their shoes polished or their car washed or what have you. And so they're not spending that money. And so big segments of the population are now having to do layoffs because not as many people are spending money. So this is maybe, okay, we're nervous, something's wrong with the money. That made itself true. And we've learned from this. We were more laissez-faire. We are more the market will regulate itself. And from the Great Depression, Keynes came up with all kinds of ideas. So Keynesian economics is we're going to prime the pump. And so when we had the 2008 economic, we don't call them panics anymore. It was a recession. But gosh, it sucked. Libraries were cutting their hours. That hurt me. I was a tutor. It's just services were dwindling, places were having layoffs. And to try to keep this from going on, the Obama administration, President Obama, was doing stimulus checks of I think it was like $350. It wasn't much, but it was enough to, okay, I have some money to spend. It wasn't to, hey, like, let me pay a credit card bill with this. This was to get people to want to buy stuff. And so it was to prime the pump, so people were spending, which kept the market going. And this happened again under the President Trump's administration because we saw an economic hiccup coming. Yeah, let's go with that. And so that's why we got the $1,200 checks followed by another $1,200 check, is because we know that keeping the market stimulated is a way to prevent layoffs and make people feel comfortable spending money. Because we learned our lesson from the Great Depression. If people aren't spending, if people aren't banking, things are going to go sideways. So that was the idea behind those stimulus checks we got. Okay? So, this is pretty horrible. Back in the day, sorry about the big size, but back in the day, banks weren't really federally regulated. There was nothing like protecting people's money. So if somebody's putting money into a bank account with the promise that they're going to get interest, they feel their money's safe, but banks make money by lending that money out. They don't keep it in this nice cozy vault just to collect money like a dragon. The banks make money by lending it out. So if I'm a banker and someone gives me $100, I was like, okay, I'm going to be super, super duper generous and give you $6 a month. Or no, sorry. I'm giving you $3 a month to hold your money. I'll give you $3 a month interest. Now I'm going to turn around and lend that $100 to someone else for a limited period. So the person I'm lending it to has to pay me $6 a month in interest, and I pay the person who's letting me hold their money $3. Once again, spitballing because no bank is that generous ever. But what happens if the borrower can't pay me that $6 a month because they don't have it? I kind of don't have the $3 to give to the person who deposited in my bank. And then I was like, okay, you're not paying me the money you owe me. You're not keeping up with the interest payments. I need the whole $100 back. But that borrower's done lost it already. So they don't have the money, and I don't have the money, and oops, now I'm bankrupt, and that means the original depositor don't have their $100 back either. So that's 3 of us out all that money. And compound that by thousands of banks and people. So that's what's happening. Do I have how many? Okay, I don't have the number for how many banks folded. Like, I think it was like 500 or 700 that first year. I think it was 9,000 banks just poof gone by the end of the Great Depression. Poof. We're like 9,000 banks died and took their customers' money with them. So from this, we get the FDIC. And I'll talk about that in the New Deal, but the FDIC ended up being deposit insurance that the federal government demands that all banks have now. So people felt confident about putting money back in, so then businesses could borrow to either hire people or get stuff to make goods. So that was like one of the immediate. Roosevelt walks into the White House, kaboom, I'm shutting all banks down until we can make sure they're solvent, and then we're going to make them have all this insurance. And they put in the Securities and Exchange Act, making sure that banks can't gamble in commodities market with savings anymore. So investment banks are now separated from savings banks. And, okay, so people were like losing hours, losing work. There were a lot of layoffs. It wasn't a majority. Like, the national unemployment rate was 20%. So there were still people, everybody was feeling it to some extent. Billionaires couldn't buy billionaire things as easily, but they were still rich as heck. Maybe they didn't have 100 servants, they had to lay them off till 50 servants, but rich people were still rich. Poor people, on the other hand, living paycheck to paycheck, some of them were losing their homes. Many of them were losing their farms. So it was hurting people. This is a picture of a line to get to a soup kitchen. Soup stretched nice and easy so people could be fed. Remember, there were no federal programs to protect the starving. That was something that charities were doing at the beginning of the Great Depression. Poor Herbert Hoover. was a laissez-faire Republican, but this poor man did more with federal power than any other president had before him. He was really, really trying, but we had never done that much with federal power. He didn't know the scope of it to begin with, and he also didn't know how bad the Great Depression was. So he's held responsible for this when he he probably wasn't as to blame as history has made him. Okay, so now this is picture of wheat. Wheat is lovely. Wheat is not really good at retaining the soil. It has shallow roots. And banks were only really lending money for people to grow wheat. But the problem is, scientists were warning, you know what? We need to plant this wheat in a way that will be more conservative or would conserve the natural soil better, because soil is breaking down. If there's a bad year, the soil will go away. And the scientists were warning about this. But fun. Okay, so between repeated plows and then there was a series of little droughts coming, the soil was gone. The ground cover was gone. And then there was a really, really a hot year, like really high temperatures, really low rain, a few years in a row, but it ended up killing a lot of the wheat around the Great Plains. And there was just dirt, exposed dirt, with nothing holding it in. And storms started kicking it up where you couldn't see like inches in front of one's face because there was so much dirt and nothing would grow. There were these big, here, I'm going to show you a picture. Not of the Okies. Okies were these migrant refugees. Like the entire Kansas plains around Oklahoma and everything, these dust bowls were blowing up, and the dirt was reaching as far as California. It was getting so bad. Nothing was growing. People couldn't breathe. It was causing electrostatic that was shocking people onto their bottoms. And then it brought locusts, because I don't know exactly why the locusts came, but then a plague of jackrabbits came. And it's not even me making stuff up. There were plagues of jackrabbits. So it was horrific. About a 10-year period where farm after farm after farm, already mortgaged to their teeth because farms weren't making a living, and now people were just losing their farms right and left. Of course, the farms didn't actually go away. They went into the banks. Like, the banks had their deeds, so they could sell them to big agribusinesses later. But for the time, the small farmers were now losing everything. So 1931, severe drought hits the Midwest and Southern Plains. As the crops die, black blizzards begin. Dust from overplowed and overgrazed lands begins to blow. 1932, the number of dust storms is increasing. 14 are reported this year. The next year would be 38. So, yeah, this dust bowl made it food scarcer, obviously, and displaced a lot of people. And back to the previous slide, these dust bowl migrants, that's the word, were headed to Oregon and California and the western areas trying to look for work. And they were competing with workers from Latin America. And because racism is endemic, the migrants from Latin America were being displaced and fired in favor of the white migrants, who were called Okies, by the way. Migrants from Oklahoma, except they weren't from Oklahoma. They were from Kansas and Nebraska, and But you know how people don't want to be specific and like lumping people under names. So they were the Okies. So here's a picture of a farm family. If you read Grapes of Wrath, that was written about the time. He saw it. He knew what he was writing about. Anyway, farm families used to be very, very big then. Imagine the burden of being a farmer and the farmer's wife and having all these starving mouths to feed. So, yeah, I feel for them. Americans unable to pay their mortgage or rent lost their homes. Those unable or unwilling to move had court-ordered eviction notice delivered by a court officer or bailiff and forced them out. So, okay. So remember how I said that 20% of the population, 20% of the population was unemployed. But then remember how I said that as people were seeking work, employers were laying off people of color in favor of the white job seeker. Not fair, not right, but it was happening. So, some black communities had 50% unemployment. And so I'm going to be linking a video of a professor from Emory University actually telling you about the Scottsboro case, because I don't have a happy ending. I don't have a nice clean summation of it, because it's one of those more problematic things in American history. But I'm just going to tell you that these young men, ages 13 to 20, were falsely convicted of assaulting two women. The women recanted, said nothing had happened. They were tried and convicted and sentenced to be executed anyway. It went to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said Alabama did a very bad job on this trial. We're remanding it back to the Alabama federal court to be retried, and the young men were convicted again. So, luckily, the only happy ending I can tell you is none of these young men were executed, but they spent like decades in prison. Like the youngest escaped. But just know that this is one of those miscarriages of justice, and they were on this train when they were arrested because they were going around from town to town looking for work so they could send to their families and have some kind of living, because the unemployment rate was so bad for African Americans. But I strongly recommend you watch the Emory University professor talk about this. I'm linking it below in the comment section. And as I said before, Hispanic workers, Asian Americans, this was hitting the different ethnic groups in different ways. So when I say 20% unemployment rate, know for a fact in some communities it's much tighter or much worse. So my notes here. In this photograph, a family gathers outside their home, being that it's just pieces of wood they were able to scavenge. In California, a typical shack in a camp of Mexican and Mexican-American migrant farm workers during the 1930s. The walls and roofs of the shack are patched together from different materials reminiscent of the Hoovervilles that many people were living in at the time. Migrant farm workers of all races lived in temporary camps like this as they moved from farm to farm to allow them seasonal work. But as I said, because so many farmers were displaced, there was an even tighter competition for this seasonal work. Once again, read Grapes of Wrath. Okay. Okay, and I'm not going to go into this, but know that at this time, Japan was actually conquering or invading Manchuria and parts of China and Korea. So they had not only the Great Depression to deal with, they had the horror of what was going on back in China to contend with, and many people still had family living there, so it was pretty horrific. Okay. As one can imagine, people didn't want to have babies right now. Birth control was still illegal. From the 1873 Comstock Act, it was illegal to distribute information about birth control or abortion. Of course, like all illegal things, people find a way. So there were methods of birth control, but for the most part, abstinence was pretty big because marriages were falling. Husbands were either leaving outright, ashamed that they couldn't earn a living, or more ashamed that their wife was earning more for some of them. So they were leaving home. People weren't getting married and weren't having babies. The pink collar work, like the secretarial, the shop work and stuff, was actually still there. There were less women being laid off than construction, steel work, like large-scale factory work. So women actually were faring better financially than their husbands were. So this was causing a lot of problems. So yeah, decline in birth rates, marriages, a lot of spousal abandonments. Interesting change in the relationship dynamics at this time. Okay, one of the most popular books at the time was Dale Carnegie's How to Win Friends and Influence People. And this, I recommend reading it. It is so good because it's like, call people by their name, look them in the eye, act like you're confident, and if you know what you're talking about, don't back down and use softening words. Say it directly. So yeah, I strongly recommend everybody read this book. But it kind of reinforced our if you're broke, it's your fault mentality that we tend to have here. So he said, yeah, times are tight, jobs are hard to come by. It's your responsibility to market yourself and bootstrap your way up and earn your living. So it's kind of, yes, this is the way it is, but you can be better than this. Take advantage of the one thing you truly own outright, your personality. But it is a hell of a book, so I can see why it sold a zillion copies. Okay. So, remember poor Herbert Hoover trying his best, trying to hold off a tidal wave with a little tiny bucket and spade. Okay. So, as people were moving around from town to town, setting up shacks outside of cities, they were calling these towns Hoovervilles. We were making things worse with our Holly Smoot tariff. By the time we repealed it, it was way too late. Things were horrible. But okay, I'm going to tell you about my favorite thing of the whole Great Depression. Well, besides my father's favorite comfort food of it's a food called SOS, something on a shingle, which is burnt gravy or burnt flour gravy over toast. Quite lovely. But anyway, besides that, for 50 years before this, or 40 years before this, women had been making clothes and tea towels and curtains and stuff out of the nice cotton cloth that flour would come in, because people were making their own bread, because bread is easy enough to make. And, of course, gravies and stuff. So women were already using these for 40 years to make clothes and such. And so some brilliant person at one of these flour mills decided, you know what? Since they're clothes anyway, why don't we put some pretty patterns on them? And it was a kindness to the community, but it was also a marketing thing because, look, we have pretty cloth and they have plain cloth. people are going to want to buy the pretty stuff. And then over time, this started evolving, and they started using paper labels that would rip off instead of big printed ones so people could have better clothes. If you look in this picture here, it's a pattern for a stuffed bunny rabbit for a person to make for the little kids. So, and this next slide, these are actually garments. The pants were purchased, but the shirts and dresses were all garments from these flour sacks. And then even through the 1950s, because this is definitely like late 40s, early 1950s fashion here, they were having sewing contests, and they kept on going with this trend until World War II, and then it's like, you know what? We really, really should be taking these cloth bags back and keep using them because rationing and such. So, but yeah, even into the 1950s, they were still having sewing contests, and people were still using these flour sacks. Okay, so poor Herbert Hoover. Okay, so at the end of World War I, we had promised our soldiers, we're going to give you a $1,000 bonus. I think it was like 20 years from the end of the war. We're going to give you a $1,000 bonus check. So a lot of these soldiers would have, been gone by then. I mean, 20 years isn't that long of a time, but, it would have been fewer than at the time. But these veterans wanted their money now. Look, we're going through the Great Depression now. We're hurting now. Can you please just give us our bonus check? And we didn't have it, and we didn't want to. So Herbert Hoover talked to one of his military leaders, pretty certain it was MacArthur. Please, this is looking really bad. Can you please get the bonus marchers off of our lawn? Because they were camped out not too far from the White House. They were in Washington, D.C. General MacArthur, taking everything to extremes, decided he was going to run tanks through and set the camp on fire. I think 2 veterans were shot. And can you imagine the optics of one of the generals on Herbert Hoover's order? He didn't order the really bad way that MacArthur did it. He just said, please make them go away. MacArthur said, mandate to get rid of them at all costs. And yeah, bad optics. President shoots veterans seeking aid. Herbert Hoover did not fare well from this. And so, this is what we call a landslide. I mean, it wasn't... Okay, it was. It was 40% to 57%. It was bad. But in the electoral vote, 472 to 79, Hoover took a bit of New England, Pennsylvania. We're getting the New Deal. We are getting FDR. Oh, yeah, and Herbert Hoover was a dry candidate. Everybody was drinking. Prohibition was a total failure. Roosevelt promised, as soon as he's in office, we're getting rid of Prohibition. I don't know how much that had to do with his landslide, but it couldn't have hurt it. And so, can you imagine that the outgoing president and the incoming president had to ride in the same darn car to the inauguration? Yeah, I see that happening now. So, this is actually a drawing based on a photograph of the time. So, back in the day, remember we still had the early November elections, but because we are still working under the old-timey thing that it took a very long time for people to travel by carriage to the place to count the votes and stuff, the actual inauguration wasn't until March. So from November, when Herbert Hoover lost, until March, he was there, being this lame duck president who couldn't do anything. he sent Roosevelt letter after letter. Please, I have some ideas. Let's work on this. Or what do you want to do? Can we work on getting the country intact? But Roosevelt was like the ultimate political creature. And he wanted to come in on March 4th as a fresh start, as the conquering hero, ignored poor Herbert Hoover, who just sat there floundering for 5 months. So there should be a checklist on Roosevelt good, Roosevelt bad. So this is one of his less good ones. But, I mean, he did a lot for this country, but him, like, letting the country just suffer because he didn't want to work with Hoover because he wanted to come in fresh was one of his negative ones. The internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, that's his worst one. He had a few other bad ones, but overall, economically, he did good for the country. So I think you should write a checklist and then decide for yourself if you like Roosevelt or not. Okay, so that's it. And then the next lecture is the New Deal. Okay, see you in our next lecture.